I'm so honored to be here. I've been able to watch the birth and growth of Planet Word, and I can't tell you how impressed I've been with Anne Friedman's amazing strength of character to power through and create this remarkable museum. So I hope if you haven't visited this museum, I urge you to do so. It's very interesting for me to be here. I'd like to make it very clear, I am not a linguist. If you want to hear a real linguist, don't listen to me. I'm the wrong person. In fact, I don't even understand much of linguistics, but then how I got here has been this odd stumbling along in the dark. And at one point I realized there is so much to be learned from language beyond what we see in traditional linguistics or psychology or any other field. And that's what I'd like to do tonight, is just give you kind of a taste of some of the ways to think about words. And before I do that, I just want to acknowledge that everything I say, I will pretend to give the impression that all of this is my ideas, but these people that you see here have been critical to my entire career. In fact, one of these names is a person that's in this very room right now. And we could vote and guess which one it is, but it's Cindy Chung. Cindy, just raise your hand. There she is right there, the amazing Cindy Chung, who's also on the board of Planet Word. So I should tell you, I hate PowerPoint. So I will show a few graphs because I just love them so much, but I'm not going to have lists of words. I'm just going to tell you a story about how I got into this world. What happened was, early in my career, I was studying one thing, looking at physical symptoms in health, and I came up with a questionnaire, and I discovered that people who were holding a big secret were much more likely to have health problems than people who may have had a similar secret experience, but they talked to other people about it. And it made me wonder, if secrets are so bad for you and people keep them for long periods of time and they're more likely to get sick, what if we brought people in the laboratory and had them write about these secrets? And these secrets often would be traumatic experiences or humiliating experiences, etc. So almost 40 years ago, I published the first paper on something that we called expressive writing. And the idea behind this was, if you bring people in the laboratory and by a flip of the coin, you ask them to write about either a traumatic experience or upsetting experience that they haven't told other people about, versus you had a group of people writing about superficial topics, and you had them write for 3 or 4 nights, for say 10 or 15 or 20 minutes per session, that those people who wrote about these upsetting experiences ended up going to the doctor at about half the rates over the next 2 or 3 months than people who were in the controlled conditions. And that first study that was published in 1986 caused a kerfuffle in the psychology literature, and it started to catch on. And here it is now 40 years later, and there have been over 2,000 studies done using this method. And it's been shown to be related to improvements in physical health, mental health, changes in the way people think, the way they sleep. It's associated with a wide range of phenomena. Putting upsetting experiences into words changes the way that they're organized in our minds. It's associated with a reduction in ruminations, or it expands what we call working memory. So if you're under a lot of stress, you're thinking about it, ruminating about it all the time. But if now you write about this upsetting experience, in some interesting ways, it resolves a lot of those issues that you've been obsessing about, and your mind is clearer. You become a better friend. You're able to connect with other people better. And you sleep better, and there are all of these biological changes that go with it. Now, when I did these first studies over about a 10-year period, I was blown away, study after study, how these effects were occurring. But one of the things that was interesting was that nobody in other labs were also struggling with this, is why does it work? And it turns out there's all sorts of reasons that it worked. But it occurred to me, maybe if I really looked at what people were writing about, I'd get a better sense of the power of expressive writing. And what I would do is I had these huge number of essays that people had written about these traumatic experiences, and I gave them to graduate students in a counseling program that I would at my university, and I had them read them and rate them on multiple dimensions, trying to get a sense of, can I tell which people will benefit by just the way they were writing? And it turned out that I couldn't do it. It was too complex, and the students didn't agree on anything, and it was expensive, and it took time, and it depressed the people who were reading it, that's not what you want with a research method. So I thought, I had taken a course in college on Fortran, which was one of the first computer languages, and I thought, how hard could it be to write a computer program? Well, it was harder than I could do, but fortunately I had a graduate student, Martha Francis, who her undergraduate degree had been in computer science, and she and I ended up writing this computer program, which we called Luke, L-I-W-C. And the computer program essentially would go in and it would capture words and calculate the percentage of words in any given text that would say were anger-related words, or social words, or all these different types of words. And we had to tell the computer what made up these categories. But once we did that, that, by the way, was the primary work, we could go through and analyze any given text and be able to tell to what degree this person is expressing these different emotions or different ways of thinking. Now, once you make a dictionary, like an anger dictionary, your life is golden in terms of being able to understand anger, or at least to calculate it, or sadness, or guilt, or et cetera, et cetera. But as long as you're doing this, we decided to do other kinds of words that you could just look up, like prepositions, or pronouns, or certain types of adverbs, et cetera. And there were books that would just lay out these words. So I started playing with this. And as I was playing with this was in the early days of the internet. And I was able to get, and people above a certain age in this room will remember the day that they got a disc in the mail, and it was America Online, AOL. And if you had a modem, you could get AOL to all of a sudden you could talk to anybody on earth. This was unbelievable. And you could go into these chat rooms, and I was fascinated by this. So every night the kids were in bed, and I would get up and I'd go downstairs and start going to different chat rooms and downloading them. And then the next morning I would run them all through my computer program. And some of the rooms were all male, some of them were all females, and I started to get a sense of, let's see how men and women differ in the way they use language. And I was blown away. There were huge differences, but they weren't any that I would expect. I would have thought that there'd be a big difference in the use of power language, or anger words, or other kinds of words. And I think many of you would make some of the same errors. I assume, in terms of who uses I words, for example, I assume males use I words. Women would use we words, like we, us, and our. Or women would use more emotion words, and men would use more kind of logical kinds of words. Everything I just told you was just the opposite. Or there were no differences. Across the board, women use I words much more than men do. And I was thinking, but wait, men are much more arrogant, narcissistic, self-important. That's true, but they don't use I words, because I words reflect something different. They reflect being self-focused. And if a person's more self-focused, they use I words. If you're writing an essay and you're writing it and there's a mirror in front of you, you will start using I words more because you're paying attention to yourself more. And the same thing, we words were weird because Some we words are like you and me together, but very often when somebody's being cold and distant, they use we words as a distraction almost. In fact, it's interesting. We have a particular U.S. president right now who historically uses I words at fairly high rates. And it's not that I think he's self-reflective, but what's interesting though is that when in the last few weeks, he has started using we words at high rates and using I words at very low rates as he was preparing to go to war. And I'll talk about this in a few minutes, but this idea of when somebody is in a psychological state of they're trying to hide something, that they're going to be aggressive, they will start using I words at much lower rates. We found this with Putin before he went into Ukraine. We found this with George Bush before we went to Iraq. We found it, I did analyses of not the Unabomber, but the Boston Marathon bomber who had a Twitter account. And in the months before, you can see exactly when he decided to get involved with his brother to do the bombing. That all of these are situations that when a person has to become deceptive, they psychologically push themselves away and they use I words at lower levels. So I words don't do what we generally think of when we're talking about language. The point is that looking at these words like pronouns and prepositions, articles, conjunctions, auxiliary verbs, negations, all of these are words they're invisible to us. If I ask you right now, have I been using a high or low rate of articles, a, n, and the? You've got absolutely no idea. I have absolutely no idea. And if now you start saying to yourself, okay, I'm going to count what his base rate is, within a minute you'll go insane, and you won't be able to hear anything else I say. The fact is, these words they go into our brain at such a high rate that we cannot consciously process, and they're very hard to manipulate. So what this means is these very words, they're called function words, and we distinguish them from content words. These function words tell us about people's psychological state. They're processed in the brain differently than our content words, and they are closely linked to parts of the brain linked to social skills and social dynamics. Now, what I'd like to tell you about is how this computer program that my students and I developed has been able to go through and look at all of these interesting ways to think about people. And for example, deception, I've already intimated. When people are lying, they tend to use I words less, and there's some other groups of function words they use less as well. People who are sad or depressed are very much self-focused. They start using I words at much higher rates. In fact, we did a study looking at suicidal versus non-suicidal poets. And you'd think that the difference would be that the suicidal poets use more sadness and depression words. There's no difference. I think to be a published poet, that's part of the job description, is you need to be kind of sad. So the language doesn't differ. The big difference is I words. Suicidal poets use I words more than non-suicidal poets. And in fact, it's a really interesting marker of suicide and suicide proneness, that when people become very, very depressed, they start looking inward at much higher rates. In fact, some people have used depression as a disease of self-focus. It's also been interesting thinking about language in other ways. I've become particularly interested in the last few years looking at how we can use language to get at how people think and get at people's thinking styles. Now, there are a lot of different ways to think about thinking styles. One is a thinking style of working through things, trying to figure things out, and when you're ruminating. And when we are in that state, we use words like think, believe, wonder, because, cause, effect, reason, rationale. You're trying to figure things out, which also means you haven't figured them out yet. And when people are in a ruminative state, they start using these at higher rates. So for example, we've been doing some work looking at people on sports teams and looking at their Twitter or other places where they are writing on social media. And if they start using these cognitive words, cognitive process words at higher rates, it's a marker and a weak predictor of injury, because they are now obsessing about things and they're probably not paying attention to their world as much as they have in the past. Now, the opposite of working through something is if you now have a good understanding of something. And now you think about it in a formal, logical, hierarchical way. And we can think of this as a form of analytic thinking. Now, the reason how I happened to become interested in this was I was working with our admissions office at the University of Texas, and I was asking them, would it be possible to go into the admissions essays of students who we have accepted and use the admissions essays to predict how well students would do at the university? And they were asking, well, what do you predict? And I said, I have no idea. Let's just look and see. By the way, many of my fellow scientists view that as not a very scientific way of thinking. But I'd like to argue that I think it is a very good scientific way of thinking, but you just have to be sure and to replicate and show that this is not some kind of fluky result. Well, the University of Texas, we got 4 years of data, which was 25,000 students who had been admitted, and each student wrote 2 essays. And I was playing with the data, and I did something that's called factor analysis. And factor analysis is looking at how groups of words are related to one another. Now, these function words, they're essentially 7 or 8 categories, depending on how you define them. But again, just very briefly, we had impersonal pronouns and personal pronouns. We had auxiliary verbs, am, as, am, has, had, etc. Negations, no, not, never. Conjunctions, but, because, and 3 others. And we correlated them all together, or did this factor analysis, and it was a single factor. And this single factor was along this dimension, and at one end were articles, A, N, and V, and prepositions, and at the other end were pronouns, auxiliary verbs, conjunctions, negations, adverbs. And these 2 were positively related to each other. These 6 were positively related to each other, and these 6 were negatively related to the articles and prepositions, meaning the person who used articles and prepositions at high rates used pronouns and auxiliary verbs at low rates. Now you're thinking, what the hell? Why am I in here? I don't even know what these things are. This is the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. Let me assure you, this is so exciting because it means there's this one dimension. And what you can do is create this dimension. So you would be along this dimension somewhere where you're using articles and prepositions at high rate, or you're using pronouns and auxiliary words at high rates, and we could put you somewhere along this continuum. And if we go through an admissions essay and we pull one out that's really high in articles and prepositions, and the essay will sound like this. There are 4 reasons I want to come to the University of Texas. The first is the psychology department has a very powerful blah, 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 blah. It's very formal. It's really logical. We get one from this end, high pronouns and auxiliary verbs. I'll never forget when my family moved from Abilene to Wichita Falls. And when we got there, I realized that I needed to understand people more because I love people and blah, blah, blah. Now, what's fascinating about it is both those kinds of essays have value, but they're very different. What which of these essays predict how well you'll do at school? As it happens, the higher people do in terms of this logical, formal thinking in their admissions essay, the better they do 4 years later when they graduate from college. And this simple correlation between this analytic measure and 4-year graduation GPA is a 0.2 correlation, which isn't bad. SATs is about a 0.3 correlation. But what's interesting is this holds up if you look at just fine arts majors, just physics majors, just social work majors, just females, just males, people whose language is not native English. It makes no difference. You can take this to the bank. People who do better at the university score higher on their admissions essay. And we know that half of these admissions essays may have been written by parents or were read closely by teachers, but it still predicts. Now, what I love about this, and what I find is that this predicts all sorts of things with students in other ways, is here's a dimension that makes no sense. From logical, formal to narrative thinking. We've never filled out a questionnaire like that. Nobody intuitively understands it. Here's a dimension of human existence that is critically important, and we've never seen it before, and it holds up across other languages that we've analyzed. In other words, this is a central feature of language that is invisible to us, and this is what I love about this world that I've fallen into. Now, I've mentioned just some of the things that we've looked at in the early days. I want to take us now into the recent work we've been doing. All this work that I've done initially was looking at individuals, but I've become increasingly interested in groups and entire cultures to try to understand, can we look at, say, the language of the United States or the language of a very large group of people to start to categorize how the culture is changing. And a good place to start would be things that occur where there are large national changes. One of the very first things that this happened with was September 11th, 9/11. And working with some of my students, we were able to get blogs from about 1,000 people who were big bloggers. And we got all of their essays. They typically wrote a minimum of 2 or 3 a week in the 3 months before to the 3 months after 9/11. And thinking of them as kind of a representative sample of America, what we find was, not surprisingly, when 9/11 occurred, a giant drop in I words, a very large increase in we words. The second thing that was interesting were emotion words. There was immediately a big increase in negative emotion words and a big drop in positive emotion words. But the positive emotion words dropped for 4 days, and then they came back up to baseline. And within a week, they were above baseline, and they stayed there for the rest of the 3 months afterwards. And also, we words remained elevated. In a weird kind of way, 9/11 was this experience that brought the culture together, and in an odd way, people were, I think, more at peace with their friends and neighbors than before. We started to look at this with COVID, and one of the things that I've been particularly interested in has been using a social media site that I love, and this is Reddit. Now, how many of you have used Reddit? Okay. Oh, very good, good. And I encourage you to continue using it because I'm using your data. And what's interesting about it is you don't put your name down. You shouldn't put your name down. But what we're able to do is to link, by your handle, you're writing about this topic in this subreddit to this topic over here in another subreddit and so forth. From a research, as a social psychologist, by the way, I'm a social psychologist and not a linguist. And that's what I love about language is I'm learning about people, and language is a wonderful way to do that. And as a social psychologist, what's interesting here is you're able to look at how a person is talking in this group, So you have this group that they're talking here, and then over here they're talking to a very different kind of group, and how much do people change as they go from group to group? In other words, we're able to get the context in which people are using language, something we've never been able to do at scale before. In any case, working with one of my graduate students at Ashwini Yashakumar, what we did was to, as soon as COVID started, we started to do all of these studies to get a sense of how was the culture changing. And today I'm just going to talk about two dimensions. One will be negative emotions and also analytic thinking. So over here we have anxiety words. Now we actually go back all the way to 2011, and the 2011 rates of anxiety words were always in this range. And then this was the beginning of March 2020, and you see anxiety words went up a rate that was stunning. And you know, this, all of us living through that, we all were incredibly anxious. And these were all from 30 subreddits that were all city-level subreddits. These represent hundreds of thousands of people, tens of millions of hosts. And you see this, and what I love about it is, you know, you hardly ever get data that's this beautiful. But now when you have these giant samples, you see signals you would never see before. And the second thing, this was the murder of George Floyd, so anxiety went up some there. And you'll see that anxiety levels remained up, and we've now taken this to March 2023, and it didn't change in terms of anxiety levels. Anger does something very different. When COVID started, most of us don't remember this, but in a weird way, after COVID started, the culture was defused. We weren't pissed off at Trump. We weren't pissed off at our neighbors. We were all terrified, and in an odd kind of sense, we were all kind of in this different psychological state until George Floyd. And it was almost as though that just set off this cultural shift. And the level of anger remained high over the next couple of years. Okay, this one is analytic thinking, and this is one that I've been particularly interested in. Remember, this is logical, formal, hierarchical thinking. The culture was thinking at a fairly, a consistent level back to 2011. And then as soon as this begins here, the culture goes stupid. We all became less capable of thinking in a logical, formal, hierarchical way. We're thinking about, where are we going to get toilet paper? What are we going to do for food? And we're doing all this different kind of thinking. And what's fascinating is analytic thinking remained depressed up through 2023. This is this working through, trying to figure things out, the cognitive processing, the rumination one. Sure enough, as soon as COVID starts, we all start obsessing more, ruminating more, and you can see that it actually peaked during George Floyd, and it gradually came down and eventually got down to baseline levels. Now, that's one interesting way of thinking, because what this is showing is we're able to get a picture of culture in ways we've never been able to do. And I guarantee you that we and other groups are looking at this in terms of what's happening right now in our culture. Now, one other thing I want to mention very briefly, and this is looking at how we can use this to understand other kinds of events. One of my former students, Sarah Siraj, was an engineer, and after she started to learn about my research, she had an NSF funding for her graduate work. She was in her third year of graduate school in engineering. Her mother was an engineer, her father was an engineer, her older sister was an engineer, and she hated being an engineer. And she came and asked if she could join my lab and become a psychologist. I was so thrilled. You can imagine her parents were too. In any case, she was great. And we started playing with this, looking at how do people react when their life turns upside down? And one of the subreddits she was interested in was breakups. So this is r/breakups. These people who are going through a breakup, go to it and they'll tell their story and other people will give them feedback and so forth. And they're really powerful stories that these people are writing. Well, what we did was we got about 6,000 of these people who were writing their stories. We lined them all up. So this is their first post about their breakup. And then we look at the way that they're using language in all their other subreddits in the year before and comparing it with the year afterwards. And we're getting a sense of how this breakup is affecting the way they're thinking and feeling. And it's also important to note that most of these people were dumped by somebody else, and they frequently would write saying, "This came out of nowhere." So the first one, now these signals for anger are a little bit messy, but you'll see in the months before the breakup, their anger levels are actually subdued in an interesting kind of way, and afterwards they go up. The anxiety one is more interesting because you see a clear signal starting about 4 months before, and their anxiety levels are going up and up and up until we see the 0, and then it takes them almost 6 months to get back down to baseline. The one on the left here is my personal favorite. That's the same analytic, logical thinking that we looked at before. And you can see, starting between 4 and 6 months before the breakup, their analytic thinking is starting to drop, and it gets lower and lower until the breakup, and then it takes about 6 months for them to get back to baseline. And the cognitive processing, remember this is the working through thing, we also see that beginning maybe 3 months before going up. By the way, the red line and the blue lines, the red lines include all the relationship subreddits, and the blue lines is when we take out all the relationship posts. So that's kind of the pure way they're talking with people who don't know what they're going through. But what's so fascinating about this for me is we are getting a signal that something's going on in their lives that they aren't processing, but it's still affecting them in some important way. Now, this kind of approach is so exciting because it's giving us a different approach, a way of thinking about people's psychological state and how it's reflected in language. Now, there's 2 or 3 things that are interesting, and I'm kind of wrapping all this up. One is by looking at this big data, we are seeing signals that are almost impossible to see. So for example, if in that breakup study, we did a study with 100 people, we would see nothing. 1,000 people, we probably would see nothing. You need to have a big sample to see these things. But what's interesting is these signals are absolutely real, but we're not accounting for much variance. Now, many people say, well, that's why you need to do laboratory studies. But the problem with laboratory studies, it's the same thing. When you do a laboratory study, you're controlling for everything as though you're looking at a psychological state that is pure. But that pure phenomenon doesn't exist in the real world. And this is the fascinating problem, and one reason I'm so excited about this big data approach. It's giving us a sense of what some of these processes are doing that we often can't see. And this brings me to my last issue, and that is the revolution in AI. This, to me, is the most exciting, thrilling thing I've ever seen in my life. And the only downside is it could bring about the complete collapse of the culture. But other than that, it is, from a pure knowledge perspective, it's amazing. And the underlying logic is really different from what modern day or science has always been. We have always been looking for kind of the pure signals. What are the processes that we are trying to understand? But think about this. When I got into science, we were told, well, the purpose of science is to understand and be able to predict behaviors. All of a sudden, we have methods that are able to predict behaviors increasingly well with greater fidelity than any theory we've ever seen. Talk to any smart person, better than that. And it's doing this by using these incredibly complex neural networks that is drawing on not just the words people are using, but also, are they male or female? Do they do this? What kind of shoes do they wear? It doesn't matter. All of these things and all of these dimensions are adding and subtracting in ways that are beyond human understanding. This is the world that we are now inhabiting. And what this has huge potential effects on psychology. For example, do we really need theories? All of a sudden, if with these large language models and AI in general, we can now start predicting things really well. Do we need theories in the same way that we have? No matter what, we need to be training our students very differently. The same thing can be said with the linguistics. The same thing can be said of physics or the study of art or anything else. We are moving into a very, very different kind of world. And I do find it wildly exciting. And if you all haven't played with these large language models, I urge you to just start playing with them and getting a sense of what they can do, and just play. And I think you'll discover these are really interesting and exciting. So, and of course, I know all of you are worried, but Jamie, what about the Luke program? Well, I actually think the Luke program, the ability to do text analysis, still has value because these large language models, they're black boxes. We don't know how they work, but it's something like a text analytic approach that tells us how things work, can give us certain perspectives as well. So let me stop here and open this up for questions. So thank you very much.
We will take a few questions from the audience, and then we'll move over to our virtual attendees.
Okay, let me
Got
just
you
show
right
you
here.
that. Oh, and here's some stuff. Okay, yes.
I was interested in your story about the University of Texas and the admission essays that you analyzed. And it seems to me there's two ways you could think of the results. One is we've learned something about the students and who's likely to be more. The other way you could look at it is we've learned something about how the university teaches. Mm-hmm. And we've
That's exactly right. And how we grade.
And did you get any?
So this is what's so interesting. What, not just the University of Texas, Western education is, we are training people to think in logical, formal, hierarchical ways. We are not training people to tell stories. So well, what about fine arts education? Go to fine arts. Compare and contrast this writer or this artist with this one. In other words, that's what modern day, and actually the history of Western education has always been. And so I think that's a really interesting question about, is this what education should be?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. This was such an interesting talk. As someone who's really interested in depression, you mentioned sort of the shift that happens from using I when people are experiencing depression to using we when we're not, right?
Or not I.
Yeah. So when we're thinking about expressive writing, can we train people to use, the I versus the we, and does it change the perspective? If you think about approaches like ACT, right? And the fusion with the self is such a sort of prominent feature of that. Is that something we can train, and is that useful when it comes to expressive writing?
So this is a great question, and it gets at this kind of fundamental issue. Do function words, for example, do they drive psychological state or do they reflect psychological state? I think they reflect it and don't drive it. And some of my students did several studies where we would browbeat or subtly manipulate people in terms of to use pronouns in one way or another. One was a study that one of my former students, Kate Niederhofer, did, where she would get a group of people and say, okay, today we're going to be talking about, it was kind of a business, it was kind of set up as a business issue. And today we're going to be talking about this topic. And I want us to use, because I want us to really get in the same mindset, and I want us to use we's. So there is no I in team. So if you use if you start using I words, I'm going to call you on it, and you need to figure out a way to talk without it. And with the idea that this should make them feel more connected. Not at all. And then we did other studies of, it was toward the end of the semester, we had students in a study saying, you're a first-year student, you've just finished this first year. We really would like to have you write about your experiences. And here's what 3 other people have written. And one person really liked the first year, another one was mixed, another one really hated it. But they were all written either in all we words or all I words. And the students afterwards, what they did was they followed it and they wrote the way that they had seen. They used I words or we words. It had zero effect in terms of their connection with the university. And it's one of the things I've been interested in. I didn't talk about this, but people who become leaders of a group use far fewer I words when they're in that group. And you can randomly assign somebody to be a leader, and that person will go in, they know, there's a leader now. They don't use I words. And when you're a leader, you're looking at the group, so you're not focusing on yourself. But imagine this. I send somebody into the room and say, okay, you're going to go in this room. The only thing is be part of the group, but don't, use we words, don't use I. It wouldn't work. But if I tell you, go in and be a leader, then your language will follow it. So, and by the way, we've done studies where we do expressive writing, pushing them to write in ways that we know are healthy from a language perspective. It has never, ever worked.
Thank you.
We'll go ahead and take a question from our virtual audience. This is from Jamie Mullen. The question is, political polling has been poorly predictive of voting behavior for the last few elections. Does linguistic analysis of Reddit, the media, or voter interviews show promise in understanding or predicting how the populace will vote?
So that's a wonderful question. And the killer problem is the same killer problem that surveys have. And that is, what kind of language samples are we going to get? And to what degree are the votes, in a close election, are these votes, are people's, so the question is, when do you get the language samples, and what do the language samples look like? Maybe if we have good language samples from these people as they get closer, we'll do better at predicting. But do those people whose language samples we're looking at, say with Reddit, to what degree do they actually reflect the voters? I would say right now, I wouldn't put a whole lot of money on it, unless you have a very large sample, and preferably the election isn't close, but then then you can just use your surveys. But in these close elections, I think it'll always be difficult. Although things might change once we move to the large language models, once we get far more data on each person than just language.
Wonderful, thank you. Any other in-person questions?
Yes.
Can you please tell us a little bit more about comparisons of different languages? From a lot of your studies have been in English, but you mentioned other languages, and we know that those reflect cultural dimensions
That's
as
right.
well. Can you expand on that?
So we've done, we and other labs have done several studies on people speaking in other languages. issues about depression and status and many of these major things have held up in Japanese, in Spanish, French, German. It's interesting, I'm right now reading Joe Henrich's book on weird cultures. And if you are not familiar with it, I think it's a superb book. Weird means Western educated, industrial, rich democracies. And what he provides really powerful evidence how people in weird worlds, these would be by and large Western Europe, US, Canada, Australia, and a few other countries, think differently than people who are not in those in terms of kind of their general perspectives. And after listening to the first few, okay, it's an audio book. After listening to the first few chapters, it makes me want to go back and dig more deeply. What we've found so far has been consistent, that when people are depressed, no matter what culture we've looked at, they're more likely to use I words. But I now am convinced I need to dig much more deeply. Yeah. I'll repeat the question.
All right. Have you been asked by attorneys or law enforcement agents to kind of look at people's writings as a kind of DNA for whether or not they might have committed a crime?
So the question is, have I been asked by FBI, CIA, judges, or defense attorneys or prosecutors to use language as some kind of clues to a person's psychological state? Yes. And the one that I'm most proud of is the case of Kathleen Folbig. She was a woman in Australia who had 4 children. All of them died what appeared to be crib death between 7 months and about 1.5 years old. And after the 4th one died, her husband turned her in for murder, convinced that she had murdered the children. And she had kept a diary the whole time, and they had done some selective stuff. The prosecutor had found a few places where she said things like, I feel so guilty that my child died. And so that was clear proof that she obviously did it. And she had been in prison for 20 years, and there had been a group of people in Australia who had been trying to get her out because they felt that she had been ramrodded. And they asked me to analyze her diaries, which I did. And one of the things I can do is I can do premeditation. If somebody's going to do something like this, there would be a clear signal there's nothing there. Another possibility is she's just crazy as a loon, and maybe there's periods where she's just full of rage and so forth. There was no evidence for that. She was probably slightly below average in terms of intelligence, but she wrote a lot. And you read her diaries, and by and large, they're just kind of boring diaries. But from a text analytic perspective, there was zero evidence of anything malicious or unpredictable about her. In any case, my report, together with some DNA work, the now ex-husband refused to give DNA samples, which I always found interesting. But they released her from prison and freed her and has been exonerated. And I got to watch this on, it was an appeals judge decision. I got to watch it live when he talked about my research and others, and it was one of those experiences that's just so overwhelming.
I have another virtual question.
Mm-hmm.
This comes from Melinda C. And the question is, do you need permission to use data from Reddit, or do you take it?
The data that we got up until March 2023, it was open access. And when you signed up to use it, you signed a waiver, knowing that this was going to be public and could be used for nonprofit reasons. And so since then, we haven't gotten, well, we're still getting data from Reddit, but is working with their new policies. So from that perspective, we did not get permission. But keep in mind, and by the way, if people want to use the data that we have, they have to analyze it they have to sign a waiver that they are not going to use it for commercial purposes. Mm-hmm.
I sometimes think about the sort of my cognitive states in writing as being a bit different than when I'm talking to my kids or talking to my dog or whatever. Have there been sort of studies to correlate your findings in analysis of written word with speech?
So we've done work where we have data from people who are writing formal things versus sometimes everyday conversation. One of my former students, Matthias Mel, has done a number of studies, dozens and dozens of studies, where we ask people to wear a microphone and it comes on for 30 seconds and goes off for X number of minutes. And they might wear this for days. So we'll analyze their everyday language, we'll analyze written things they've done. And generally, they are positively correlated, not hugely correlated, but their use of pronouns, prepositions, article, etc., are almost always positively correlated from one context to another. But language changes across context. So a person in church uses more formal language than a person when they're hanging around their buddies in a bar.
Let's go ahead
Have
and
you
take... Sorry, please go ahead.
Have you ever been approached by any politicians, other professors, to work on speech writing so that when a politician does try to convey something, it's more positive and perhaps could be used for civil dialogue?
Yes, I have been approached by people in the political world sometimes. And, it's so interesting. One of the first things that got me into this was the use of the word we. There's this sense that we words are conveying this sense of community. And I was particularly interested in the presidential election between George Bush and John Kerry. And I don't know if you remember, but Kerry was very stiff and cold. And I read in the New York Times that his advisors were now telling him to start using we words more. Well, Jesus, God, that was the dumbest thing that you could ever do, because using we words is really off-putting, because the audience listens to this and they're trying to figure out, who is that we? Am I part of that we? And you compare that with George Bush, who used we words at very low rates, and he used I words, and he came across as much more personable and warm. So this is one of these things that, political advisors, like all humans, have these theories that frankly, before I started this, I would have had the same theories, but nobody had ever gone about testing them in one way or another. Mm-hmm.
We will take one more from our virtual audience. We've got a question from Bud Hensgen. Please forgive me if I've mispronounced. The question is, how do you think AI might affect education in the future? How can teachers and school systems prepare themselves?
So this is the million-dollar question. I think AI is going to turn traditional education upside down. And I strongly encourage my colleagues and even friends who are teachers in elementary and high school to get their students using AI as much as possible. Why? Because they are going to use it as much as possible once they're out there in the real world. They need to know how to leverage this into becoming a better thinker, and a better evaluator of good writing. I think it's here, and we can't fight it. You can't tell people to not use it. And again, I've found it so interesting in my own world in terms of letters of recommendation, in terms of articles, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I'll do something and then I'll have AI do it, and I'll look at what AI does and just think, ooh, that's a good point, and I'll add it to it. And the fact is it's a really different way of thinking, but it's going to change our culture. So I think from an educational perspective, I think trying to fight it stuff is not a very effective strategy.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from our in-person audience? We'll take one last question.
As someone who's spent a lot of time arguing in favor of theories, using theories, I took note of your point about maybe theories are no longer required. And I'm wondering if with large language models, a theory would be helpful to help interpret the results or predict results. What do you think?
So your question is, I think, one of the central issues. And the problem is, in the real world, if we ask, you know, well, how does that bridge work? You know, what's the theory of bridge? Well, it's a stupid question because there are all of these theories that are interacting that hold that bridge up. And one of the interesting things with AI is I can run a lot of data, and then I'll say, how did you make this prediction? Now, sometimes it'll be, the typical kind of bullshit drunk uncle who comes up with some theory. It doesn't know because it's too complex. And it's a little bit like asking people, why did you do this? Well, we're all like our drunk uncle that we can come up with theory why we do it, but we don't really know because we have these millions of neurons all firing in different ways, and it just happens. So I think that's the issue. Now, it's not that theories are useless, they're not, but the issue is once you throw in, 10,000 variables, and each of these things is pushing the equation, so you could have a theory for this person in this context, in this situation, and you could, a certain graph would predict really well, but then as you pull out, and all these other overlapping graphs are there, it really does. What I find so interesting is it really does raise fascinating questions about the value of theory here in this new world. And I got to tell you, I find that so much fun. It's just like poking the bear. I just get such a kick out of it. Okay, well, thank you all very much.